611 men. That's how many sailed out of Falmouth Harbor on the evening of March 26, 1942, aboard a convoy so improbable that the German defenders who would eventually face it refused to believe what they were seeing. An obsolete American destroyer, stripped of 2 of its 4 smokestacks and disguised to resemble a German warship, packed with over 4 tons of high explosives hidden behind steel and concrete in its bow. 18 small wooden-hulled motor launches trailing behind it, their mahogany decks carrying commandos in blackened faces and woolen cap comforters, each man armed with a Thompson submachine gun, fighting knives, and enough demolition charges to reduce an industrial dock to rubble. They crossed 400 miles of open Atlantic, navigated a shallow estuary bristling with coastal batteries, and rammed the single most strategically important dry dock in occupied Europe at 20 knots. The explosion that followed, delayed by hidden fuses until German officers were standing on the deck inspecting the wreckage the next morning, was so powerful it killed over 360 of them and rendered the dock inoperable for the next 6 years. Of the 611 who sailed, 169 never came home. 215 spent the rest of the war behind barbed wire. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than for any other single operation in the entire Second World War. And here is the detail that makes this story something more than a tale of extraordinary courage. When Winston Churchill authorized this operation, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States and Britain's most important ally, was not consulted. He was not asked for permission. He was not even informed until after the commandos had already sailed. Churchill didn't need Roosevelt's approval. He didn't want it. And the reason why reveals everything about the kind of war Churchill was fighting in 1942, a war not just against Nazi Germany, but against the creeping paralysis of caution that threatened to strangle Britain's capacity to strike back at a moment when striking back was the only thing keeping the nation alive. To understand why Churchill acted alone, you have to understand what Britain looked like in the opening months of 1942. The picture was bleak enough to break weaker men. Singapore had fallen to the Japanese on February 15th, surrendering approximately 80,000 Commonwealth troops in what Churchill himself called the worst disaster in British military history. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps was pushing the Eighth Army back toward Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, and with it, Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant shipping at a rate that exceeded new construction. Between January and March 1942, over 1.2 million tons of shipping were sent to the bottom. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, and with it the capacity to feed Britain, fuel its war machine, and maintain the transatlantic supply lines upon which everything depended. The United States had entered the war following Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and Churchill had famously written that night that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. But American entry into the war did not translate into immediate military relief. The United States was mobilizing on a vast scale, converting its industrial economy to war production, training millions of men, and building the ships, aircraft, and weapons that would eventually turn the tide. But that process would take months, possibly years. In the spring of 1942, American ground forces had not yet engaged the Germans in any theater. The first major American ground operation in Europe would not come until Operation Torch in November of that year, a full 8 months after the raid Churchill was now planning. Roosevelt, for his part, was navigating political waters that Churchill, as a wartime leader with parliamentary support, did not have to contend with in the same way. The American public, despite the shock of Pearl Harbor, remained deeply divided about the scale and nature of American involvement in the European war. Isolationist sentiment, though diminished, had not disappeared. Roosevelt's military advisors, led by General George Marshall, were focused on building up American forces for an eventual cross-channel invasion of France, a strategy that prioritized accumulation over action. The American approach was fundamentally one of preparation. Churchill's instinct was the opposite. He believed with every fiber of his being that a nation at war must be seen to fight, must be seen to attack, must project aggression, even when the strategic balance argued for patience. It was not recklessness. It was a calculated understanding that morale, both military and civilian, was a weapon as potent as any battleship or bomber squadron. And in early 1942, British morale was hemorrhaging. This was the context in which Churchill turned to the force he had created specifically for moments like this. The British commandos had been born from the ashes of Dunkirk. On June 6, 1940, just 48 hours after the last British soldier was pulled from the beaches of northern France, Churchill had composed a memorandum to General Hastings Ismay that would alter the trajectory of the war. He demanded the creation of specially trained troops of the Hunter class who could develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. The language was deliberate. Churchill wanted offensive action at a time when every military logic argued for defense. Britain had just lost its entire continental army. The threat of German invasion was real and immediate. Every available resource was being directed toward the defense of the home islands. And yet Churchill insisted on attack. The man he chose to oversee this program of raids was Lord Louis Mountbatten, appointed Chief of Combined Operations in October 1941 with the rank of Commodore and instructions that left no room for ambiguity. Churchill told Mountbatten his task was to continue the commando raids, maintain the offensive spirit, gain essential experience, and above all, prepare for the eventual liberation of Europe. Churchill summed up his expectations with characteristic directness. He told Mountbatten he wanted the south coast of England turned from a bastion of defense into a springboard of attack. By the time Mountbatten took command, the commandos had already conducted several operations, though with mixed results. The first raid, Operation Collar, launched against the French coast near Le Touquet on the night of June 24, 1940, had been little more than a probe. 115 men from No. 11 Independent Company landed on 4 beaches, killed 2 German sentries, gathered no intelligence, and returned. The only British casualty was Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, there as an observer, who received a bullet graze. It was inauspicious, but it was a beginning. Operation Claymore, launched against the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway on March 4, 1941, was the first operation that demonstrated what the commandos could achieve when properly planned and executed. 500 men from No. 3 and No. 4 Commando, supported by 52 Norwegian volunteers and escorted by 5 Royal Navy destroyers, landed at 4 ports inside the Arctic Circle. Their objective was the destruction of fish oil production facilities that supplied glycerin to the German explosives industry. The commandos demolished every factory they targeted, destroyed approximately 3,600 tons of oil and glycerin, sank 18,000 tons of enemy shipping, and returned with 228 German prisoners and over 300 Norwegian volunteers for the Free Norwegian Forces. Not a single commando was killed. The only injury was self-inflicted, an officer who accidentally shot himself in the thigh with his own revolver. Churchill issued a personal memo of congratulations. More importantly, the captured materials included Enigma codebooks and encryption equipment from the German armed trawler Krebs, intelligence that allowed Bletchley Park to read German naval codes for months afterward and contributed directly to saving Allied lives in the Battle of the Atlantic. The raid achieved its military objectives, boosted British morale, and produced an intelligence windfall that its planners had not anticipated. It also forced Germany to reinforce its garrison in Norway, diverting troops and resources from other theaters. This was precisely the kind of disproportionate effect Churchill had envisioned. But Churchill wanted more. The raids on remote Norwegian fishing villages, however successful, did not carry the symbolic weight he believed was necessary. He needed something spectacular, something that would demonstrate to the occupied nations of Europe, to Stalin demanding a second front, and to the Americans still finding their footing that Britain was capable of striking at the heart of German-occupied territory. The target he and Mountbatten identified was the Normandy dry dock at the port of Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of France. The strategic logic was compelling. The German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck, had been declared operational in January 1942 and moved to the Norwegian fjords. The Tirpitz displaced over 42,000 tons and carried 8 15-inch guns capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 35 kilometers. Her armor belt was over 300 millimeters thick. Her top speed of 30 knots meant she could outrun most Allied escort vessels. If she broke out into the North Atlantic, she could devastate Allied convoys with near impunity. And the memory of what the Bismarck had done in May 1941, sinking HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, with a single devastating salvo in the Denmark Strait, made the threat vivid and immediate. The Bismarck herself had been heading for Saint-Nazaire for repairs when she was hunted down and sunk by the Royal Navy. Churchill understood with crystalline clarity that the Tirpitz did not need to fire a single shot to alter the strategic balance. Her mere existence forced the Royal Navy to keep 6 battleships, 4 British and 2 American, in constant readiness in case she made a dash for open water. Those 6 capital ships and the cruisers and destroyers that screened them were effectively pinned in place by a single German warship sitting in a Norwegian fjord. It was an intolerable diversion of resources at a time when every ship was desperately needed elsewhere, escorting convoys in the Atlantic, supporting operations in the Mediterranean, reinforcing the crumbling position in the Far East. Churchill was obsessed with the threat the Tirpitz posed. He wrote repeatedly to his chiefs of staff about the necessity of neutralizing her, and the destruction of the Normandy dry dock at Saint-Nazaire became his preferred solution. The Normandy dry dock was the only facility on the entire Atlantic seaboard of Europe, large enough to accommodate the Tirpitz for repairs. It had been built in 1932 to service the French ocean liner SS Normandy, and it measured over 350 meters in length, 50 meters in width, and was the largest dry dock in the world. If it could be destroyed, the Tirpitz would be unable to seek repair on the Atlantic coast if damaged in action, effectively confining her to Norwegian waters and neutralizing her as a strategic threat to Atlantic shipping without firing a single shell at her hull. The plan that Mountbatten's staff devised was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. An obsolete destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, formerly the USS Buchanan, one of 50 American destroyers transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, would be modified to resemble a German vessel of the Moa class. 2 of her 4 funnels would be removed, and the remaining 2 cut at oblique angles. Her bow would be packed with approximately 4.5 tons of Amatol high explosive, concealed behind steel and concrete where no casual inspection would find it. Delayed action pencil fuses would be set to detonate hours after the ship had rammed the dock gate. The Campbelltown would cross 400 miles of open sea, navigate the shallow, treacherous estuary of the Loire River, and ram the southern gate of the Normandy dock at maximum speed. Meanwhile, commandos carried aboard the destroyer, and in 18 accompanying motor launches would go ashore and systematically demolish the dock's pumping stations, winding houses, and operating machinery with prepared demolition charges. The motor launches would then evacuate the surviving raiders back to the open sea, where they would rendezvous with escort destroyers for the return to England. The entire operation was to be completed before dawn. The Admiralty's initial reaction was negative. They did not want to sacrifice a destroyer, even an obsolete one. The RAF was reluctant to commit bombers to a diversionary raid over the town. The Foreign Office worried about civilian casualties and the political implications of a large-scale military operation on French soil. Churchill overrode them all. The approval came on March 3, 1942, giving the planners barely 3 weeks to finalize preparations, train the assault teams, and sail, and here is where the relationship with Roosevelt becomes critical. The Campbelltown was an American-built destroyer, transferred to Britain under a program that Roosevelt had negotiated with great political difficulty against fierce isolationist opposition. The Destroyers for Bases deal of August 1940 had been one of the most significant steps Roosevelt took towards supporting Britain before Pearl Harbor, trading 50 aging destroyers for 99-year leases on British bases in the Western Hemisphere. Every one of those destroyers carried symbolic weight. They represented American commitment to British survival at a time when that commitment was uncertain and politically contested. Churchill was now proposing to take one of those American destroyers, strip it down, fill it with explosives, and deliberately destroy it by ramming it into a German-held dock in occupied France. The operation carried enormous risk of failure. If it went wrong, if the ship was captured intact, if the commandos were annihilated without achieving their objective, the political fallout would extend far beyond military embarrassment. It would be an American ship given in good faith for the defense of the Atlantic, wasted in what critics would call a reckless adventure. Churchill did not seek Roosevelt's permission. He did not even inform the president in advance. The decision to launch Operation Chariot was made within the British chain of command, authorized by Churchill and the Chiefs of Staff, executed by Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters, and communicated to Washington only after the force had sailed. Churchill's message to Roosevelt came after the fact, a cable sent on April 1, 1942, in which he expressed delight about what he called Dickey's show in St. Nazaire. The tone was celebratory, not apologetic. There was no request for retroactive approval. There was no acknowledgement that prior consultation might have been appropriate. Churchill treated the operation as a purely British affair, conducted with British forces, under British command, in pursuit of British strategic objectives. The fact that the ship was American-built was, in Churchill's view, irrelevant. It had been given to Britain. It was Britain's to use. This was not an isolated instance of Churchill acting independently. It reflected a fundamental difference in how the two leaders understood the alliance that was forming between their nations. Roosevelt saw the Anglo-American partnership as a collaborative enterprise requiring mutual consultation on major military decisions. Churchill, while valuing Roosevelt's support enormously and working tirelessly to maintain the relationship, never accepted that Britain had surrendered its sovereign right to conduct military operations as it saw fit. Britain had been fighting alone for over a year before America entered the war. Churchill had created the commandos, built the raiding infrastructure, and developed the operational doctrine without American input or assistance. He was not about to ask permission to use them. The execution of Operation Chariot on the night of March 28, 1942, unfolded with a violence and heroism that exceeded even the most dramatic expectations. The convoy sailed from Falmouth on the 26th and made the crossing without incident, aided by the remarkable stroke of fortune that the German submarine U-593, which spotted the convoy, reported an incorrect course, sending 6 German destroyers from St. Nazaire on a fruitless chase in the wrong direction. Commander Robert Ryder led the naval task force. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman commanded the commando assault. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty captained the Campbelltown. The convoy entered the Loire estuary flying a German naval ensign, a legitimate ruse de guerre under international law. When challenged by German shore batteries, the ships signaled that they were a friendly force proceeding to harbor. This deception bought precious minutes, allowing the convoy to close within range of the dock before the Germans opened fire. When the shooting started, the British lowered the German flag and raised the white ensign. The Campbelltown surged forward at full speed. The final approach was devastating. Every German gun in the harbor turned on the convoy. The motor launches, built of mahogany with no armor protection, were torn apart. Their auxiliary fuel tanks turned them into floating pyres. Commandos died in the water, on burning decks, in launch after launch that was struck, holed, and sunk before reaching the shore. But the Campbelltown, her bridge crew shielded by hastily welded steel plates, drove through the fire. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, who had set the delayed fuses on the concealed explosives, was on the bridge calling out navigational adjustments. Beatty lost 2 helmsmen to enemy fire. The ship struck a submerged obstacle, came free, tore through an anti-submarine net, and at 1:34 in the morning struck the southern gate of the Normandy dry dock at approximately 20 knots, wedging herself firmly onto the massive steel caisson. The commandos poured off the ship and onto the dock. Despite withering fire from German positions on all sides, demolition teams reached their targets. They destroyed the pumping house that controlled the dock's water levels, the winding house that operated the caisson gate mechanisms, and critical electrical infrastructure. Every charge was placed exactly as rehearsed. Every objective assigned to the teams that made it ashore was achieved. Captain Bill Pritchard of the Royal Engineers, the demolitions expert who had designed the charges, had trained his men so thoroughly that they executed their tasks amid chaos that would have paralyzed less prepared soldiers. But the evacuation plan collapsed. The motor launches that were supposed to carry the commandos back to sea had been largely destroyed in the approach. Newman, realizing that no extraction was possible by water, ordered his surviving men to fight their way through the town and attempt to escape overland to Spain, nearly 400 miles to the south. Small groups of commandos fought running battles through the streets of St. Nazaire, engaging German troops in close combat with Thompson submachine guns, grenades, and fighting knives. Most were eventually overwhelmed and captured. 5 commandos made it to Spain and eventually returned to Britain, an extraordinary journey through occupied France that constitutes an epic of evasion in its own right. The Campbelltown sat wedged on the dock gate throughout the following morning. German officers came aboard to inspect her. Soldiers posed for photographs on her deck. Engineers examined her structure, puzzled by the concrete and steel reinforcement in her bow, but apparently not suspecting its purpose. At approximately noon on March 29th, roughly 10 hours after the ramming, the hidden charges detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The dock gate was obliterated. The blast killed an estimated 360 German personnel who were on or near the ship, including many of the officers and engineers who had been inspecting her. The Normandy dry dock was rendered completely inoperable. It would not be repaired until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. The Tirpitz, the strategic justification for the entire operation, never entered the Atlantic. She remained in the Norwegian fjords until the RAF destroyed her with tallboy bombs in November 1944. The human cost was staggering. Of the 611 men who sailed from Falmouth, 169 were killed. 215 were captured, many of them wounded. Only 228 returned to England. The commandos suffered disproportionately, with approximately 72% of their number killed, wounded, or captured. The 5 Victoria Crosses awarded to Commander Ryder, Lieutenant Commander Beatty, Lieutenant Colonel Newman, Sergeant Thomas Durant, and able seaman William Savage recognized acts of valor that went beyond anything that military decorations were designed to honor. Durant, manning an exposed Lewis gun on a motor launch, continued firing at a German destroyer at point-blank range despite being wounded repeatedly. He died of his wounds. His Victoria Cross was recommended by the German naval officer who captured his position, a distinction almost without precedent. Churchill received the news with intense satisfaction. His cable to Roosevelt about Dickey's show was followed by broader strategic communications in which he used St. Nazaire as evidence of British offensive capability. When Churchill flew to Moscow in August 1942 to deliver the unwelcome news that there would be no second front in Europe that year, he was able to point to St. Nazaire and to the Dieppe raid that followed in August as demonstrations that Britain was actively striking at the German-occupied coastline. Stalin, who had been demanding immediate action to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, was unimpressed by raids when he wanted full-scale invasions. But Churchill argued, with some justification, that the commando operations were not merely pinpricks. They forced Germany to divert substantial forces to defend the Atlantic Wall, a defensive line that would eventually stretch from Norway to Spain and absorb hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and millions of tons of concrete and steel that might otherwise have been deployed against the Soviet Union. The broader pattern of Churchill's independent action extended well beyond St. Nazaire. Operation Postmaster, conducted in January 1942, just weeks before Chariot was approved, saw commandos and agents of the Special Operations Executive seize 3 Axis ships from the harbor of Santa Isabel on the Spanish-controlled island of Fernando Po in West Africa. The operation was politically explosive. Fernando Po was a neutral Spanish colony, and the raid constituted a blatant violation of Spanish sovereignty. The British Foreign Office opposed it. The British Embassy in Madrid opposed it. The general officer commanding West Africa Command refused to support it. The Admiralty suspended it. And then Churchill, through the SOE, and the Foreign Office, authorized it anyway. The raiders, 11 commandos, and 4 SOE agents, supported by 17 locally recruited men, lured the enemy crews ashore with a lavish party organized by an undercover SOE agent, boarded the ships under cover of darkness, overpowered the skeleton crews, and towed the vessels to Lagos. The entire operation took 30 minutes. No raiders were killed. Spain was furious. Its foreign minister described the operation as an intolerable attack on Spanish sovereignty and threatened armed reprisal. The British government denied all involvement, attributing the raid to Free French forces, a fiction that was transparently false but diplomatically useful. Churchill had gambled that Spain, despite its sympathies for the Axis and its fury at the violation of its territory, would not enter the war over 3 stolen ships. He was right. Roosevelt was not consulted about Operation Postmaster either. The operation was conceived, planned, and executed entirely within the British Special Operations apparatus, authorized by SOE leadership and backed by Churchill personally against the objections of multiple senior British officials. The stakes were enormous. Had Spain entered the war on the Axis side, the strategic consequences would have been catastrophic, threatening Gibraltar, closing the Western Mediterranean, and potentially cutting Britain's sea routes to the Middle East and India. Churchill accepted that risk because he believed the strategic gains, disrupting Axis shipping operations and demonstrating British willingness to strike anywhere, outweighed the diplomatic dangers. This pattern of independent British action was not born from arrogance or disregard for the alliance with America. It was born from necessity and from Churchill's profound understanding of what war demanded. Britain in 1942 was fighting for its survival. The country had been at war for over 2 years before America joined. It had endured the Blitz, the fall of France, the loss of its Continental Army, the Battle of the Atlantic, and the catastrophic defeats in the Far East, and it had done so largely alone. Churchill had created the commandos, the SOE, and the entire apparatus of unconventional warfare specifically because Britain could not match Germany in conventional military power. The commandos were the sharp edge of a strategy born from weakness, a strategy that said, if you cannot overwhelm the enemy with numbers and material, you must strike him where he least expects it, with speed, surprise, and violence that makes him believe you are stronger than you are. The commandos themselves were the product of a volunteer ethos that Churchill championed from the beginning. Every man was a volunteer drawn from regular army units, required to meet physical standards that eliminated all but the most capable. When the call went out in the summer of 1940, over 2,000 men submitted their names. They came from every branch of the British Army, infantry regiments, artillery batteries, engineer companies, signals units. The selection criteria were deliberately broad in one sense. Any soldier could apply, but mercilessly narrow in another. Only the most physically fit, mentally resilient, and aggressively spirited were accepted. The initial intake was organized into 12 commando units of approximately 500 men each, broken into a headquarters element and 10 troops. Training was conducted primarily at the Commando Basic Training Centre at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands, a facility that became legendary for its intensity and its casualty rate during exercises. The program encompassed amphibious assault techniques, including landing from assault craft in heavy surf and scaling cliffs with rope and grappling hooks. Demolitions training covered military and improvised explosives, teaching men to destroy bridges, railway lines, harbor installations, and industrial targets with calculated precision. Close-quarters combat instruction included unarmed fighting techniques, knife work, and the use of the Thompson submachine gun and Colt automatic pistol at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Rock climbing, night navigation, forced marches with heavy loads over the Scottish mountains, and survival training in conditions that simulated operating behind enemy lines for extended periods without resupply all formed part of the curriculum. Live ammunition was used in training exercises. Men were killed during training at Achnacarry. This was considered acceptable. The philosophy was brutally simple. Better to lose men in training than to send inadequately prepared soldiers against German defenders who would show no mercy. The men selected for Operation Chariot were drawn primarily from No. 2 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Newman, reinforced with demolition specialists from other commando units and the Royal Engineers. In the weeks before the raid, they trained at locations along the south coast of England, practicing the specific demolition tasks each team would be required to perform at St. Nazaire. Scale models of the dock were constructed from aerial reconnaissance photographs, and each man memorized his route from the landing point to his assigned target. The demolition charges were designed by Captain Bill Pritchard to be as compact and efficient as possible, each one tailored to the specific structure it was meant to destroy. Teams rehearsed their tasks until they could execute them in darkness, under fire, with the certain knowledge that the margin between success and failure would be measured in seconds. By 1942, over 30 commando units had been formed, along with 4 assault brigades and specialist units, including the SOE's Small-Scale Raiding Force, No. 62 Commando, which had conducted Operation Postmaster. The commando training system had become an assembly line for the kind of soldier Churchill had envisioned in his 1940 memorandum. Men of the hunter class who combined physical toughness, technical skill, and an offensive mindset that no amount of enemy fire could extinguish. The legacy of Churchill's independent commando operations extends far beyond the tactical achievements of individual raids. St. Nazaire, Claymore, Postmaster, and the dozens of other operations conducted along the Atlantic Wall between 1940 and 1944 collectively achieved strategic effects that shaped the course of the war. They forced Hitler to issue his infamous Commando Order in October 1942, directing that all captured commandos be executed regardless of whether they were in uniform or had surrendered. The order, which violated the Geneva Convention, was itself evidence of the psychological impact the raids were having on German command. Hitler described the commandos as terror and sabotage troops. German propaganda called them murderous thugs. These were the words of men who were afraid. The commando raids also generated intelligence of enormous value. The Enigma materials captured during Operation Claymore contributed to breaking German naval codes. The rotors and documentation seized from the armed trawler, Krebs provided Bletchley Park with the keys to decrypt German naval communications for weeks. Intelligence that allowed Allied convoys to be rerouted away from U-boat concentrations and saved thousands of lives. This single intelligence windfall, produced as a secondary benefit of a commando raid designed primarily for industrial sabotage, demonstrated the extraordinary breadth of effects that unconventional operations could achieve. Beach reconnaissance operations conducted by small commando parties along the French and Low Countries coastlines under code names like Hardtack and Tarbrush provided photographs, soil samples, and detailed surveys of obstacles and mines that would prove critical for planning the Normandy landings. Every raid taught lessons about amphibious assault, ship-to-shore movement, beach obstacles, and German defensive tactics that fed directly into the planning for Operation Overlord. 12 men went missing during the hardtack raids alone, and only 5 were ever accounted for. Their sacrifice purchased information that would save thousands on the beaches of Normandy. And the raids provided the institutional foundation for a special operations capability that would endure long after the war ended. The Commando ethos, the philosophy that small groups of highly trained volunteers could achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers, became the founding principle of the post-war Special Air Service, the Special Boat Service, and eventually the Royal Marines Commandos. The American military, too, absorbed the lessons. The U.S. Army Rangers, modeled directly on the British Commandos and initially trained at the British Commando Training Center at Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands, carried the commando philosophy into American Special Operations doctrine. Churchill never apologized for acting without Roosevelt's knowledge or consent. In his memoirs, he treated the commando raids as sovereign British operations conducted under British authority in pursuit of British strategic objectives. The fact that they contributed to the broader Allied war effort was, in Churchill's framing, a fortunate consequence rather than their primary justification. He had told Roosevelt in one of their private exchanges that the essence of defense was to attack the enemy and leap at his throat and keep the grip until the life is out of him. The commandos were the hands around the throat. Roosevelt, for his part, appears to have accepted Churchill's independent actions with equanimity, at least in public. The two men exchanged an estimated 1,700 letters and telegrams during the war and met 11 times, spending approximately 120 days in close personal contact. Their relationship was complex, marked by genuine warmth, mutual respect, and significant disagreements over colonial policy, the timing and location of the cross-channel invasion, and the post-war international order. But on the question of commando operations, Roosevelt seemed content to let Churchill proceed as he saw fit, recognizing perhaps that the political cost of objecting to successful British operations was greater than the cost of tolerating them. The morning after the Campbelltown exploded at St. Nazaire, a German officer standing on the dockside stared at the crater where the southern gate of the Normandy dry dock had been. The gate was gone. The dock floor was flooded. Debris from the ship and the dock infrastructure was scattered across hundreds of meters. Bodies of German soldiers and sailors were being pulled from the wreckage. The officer turned to a subordinate and asked a question that no one present could answer. How did they get through? The answer was not complicated. A prime minister who believed that attack was the only acceptable posture for a nation at war had created a force designed to embody that belief. He had given that force a target of strategic importance, authorized its destruction using an American-built ship packed with British explosives, and sent 611 men across 400 miles of hostile ocean to do what needed to be done. He did not ask Roosevelt. He did not ask the Admiralty's permission, not really. He did not wait for conditions to be perfect or risks to be acceptable. He understood something that cautious men in comfortable offices would never grasp. In war, the only permission that matters is the permission you give yourself to act. 611 men sailed from Falmouth. 169 did not come back. The dock they destroyed stayed broken until 1948. The battleship it was built to service never reached the Atlantic. 5 Victoria Crosses, 89 decorations, and a legacy that the French town of St. Nazaire honors to this day, when veterans and their descendants march through streets where commandos once fought and where the first prime minister of the post-war French Republic told them, "You were the first to give us hope." Churchill sent his commandos. He did not ask for permission, and 611 men proved that he was right not to.